Welcome to the deep dive. We're tackling a really important and frankly kind of complex issue today. Vehicle emissions regulations right here in the U.S.
Yeah, it's definitely got a lot of moving parts.
It does. And we've pulled together some interesting sources for you. News articles covering the latest moves, official government docs with the real nitty-gritty.
And even a discussion we found over on Reddit, people trying to figure out what the actual differences are in the cars themselves, plus some academic analysis too.
Exactly. So our mission really is to try and cut through some of that complexity, give you a clearer picture of what's going on.
We'll look at the Biden administration's new emissions rules, the big ones finalized recently.
And then stack that up against California's, well, pretty ambitious goals.
Yeah.
The ones aiming to phase out new gas car sales entirely.
Right. It's definitely a situation with conflict and big implications for, well, everyone, consumers, the auto industry, the air we breathe.
Okay, let's dive in then. The Biden administration, they finalized this new EPA rule, Environmental Protection Agency, back in March 2024.
And the headlines, you probably saw them, called it the toughest standards ever for U.S. tailpipe emissions.
Yeah, although, interestingly, it ended up a little less aggressive than what they first proposed, right?
That's true. But the main goal is still pretty significant, aiming for at least 50%, half, of all new car sales to be zero emissions by 2030.
So what does this EPA rule actually require? What's the core of it?
Okay, so the key thing is manufacturers have to meet these new average emission standards across their whole fleet.
Fleet-wide average, okay.
Yeah, for all their new vehicles, cars, SUVs, light and medium-duty trucks, vans, starting with model year 2027 and going through 2032.
And they're calling it technology neutral, which sounds important.
It is important because it basically means the EPA isn't saying how car makers have to hit those lower emission targets.
So they have choices.
Exactly. They can use, cleaner gasoline engines, regular hybrids, plug-in hybrids.
Or go full electric.
Or full battery electric vehicles, yeah. The really crucial point here, and it gets confused sometimes, is that this federal rule is not a ban on gasoline cars.
Right. It's about lowering that average.
Yeah.
So how much lower are we talking? Is it a big drop?
It's pretty substantial. By the time we get to model year 2032, the target is roughly halving the average emissions compared to the 2027 models.
Wow. Having in just 5 years. That's ambitious.
It is. And if companies don't meet these averages...
Uh-oh. Penalties.
Big penalties. For the companies, not for you buying a car. But yeah, potentially adding up to billions of dollars across the industry.
Billions. Okay, that certainly gets the automakers' attention. So what does the EPA think this will achieve? What are the projections?
Well, the EPA's put out some pretty big numbers. They're forecasting about a 7.2 billion metric ton reduction in CO2 emissions by 2055.
7.2 billion, okay. And what about EV adoption?
They see that increasing significantly, projecting somewhere between 30% and maybe 56% of new light-duty vehicle sales being EVs by the early 2030s.
And health benefits, too, I imagine. Cleaner air.
Definitely. They estimate around $13 billion in annual health benefits from reduced pollution.
$13 billion a year. And what about my wallet? Any savings projected there?
Yeah, two big ones. First, about $46 billion saved nationwide each year on fuel costs.
$46 billion. Wow.
And second, another $16 billion saved annually on maintenance and repairs, mostly because EVs, they tend to need less upkeep.
Fewer oil changes, maybe less brake wear. I can see that adding up. Sounds pretty positive overall, but rules like this always get pushback, right? What are the criticisms?
They really come from sort of two main directions.
Yeah.
On one side, you have folks saying, look, even if these are the toughest standards, they still don't go far enough.
Not aggressive enough for climate goals.
Right. Not enough to really hit net zero targets quickly. But then on the other side, you hear concerns about limiting public choice.
The argument that it pushes people towards certain types of cars.
Exactly. That it might restrict the vehicles available, maybe drive up costs, and infringes on, consumer freedom.
Okay, so that's the federal picture. Let's switch gears now and talk California, because they're on a different track, it seems.
A very different track. Their Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule, well, it's much more direct.
What's the headline there?
The headline is a full ban on the sale of new gasoline-powered cars by 2035.
A ban. Okay, that's clear. And this wasn't out of the blue, right? It's been developing.
No, it stems from an executive order back in 2020, and then they finalized the actual regulations in 2022.
Now, California has this unique ability under the Clean Air Act to set its own stricter rules, doesn't it? because of its, like, historical smog problems.
Precisely. The Clean Air Act allows California to request a waiver from the EPA for stricter standards, largely because of its unique and severe air pollution issues. Smog, ozone, vehicles are a huge part of that, like 80% of the problem in some areas.
And the EPA granted that waiver for this latest rule?
They did, just this past December 2024.
So California's ban is a go. Green light.
Well, that's where it gets complicated again. Getting the waiver was a huge step, but it immediately triggered opposition.
Because what California does doesn't just stay in California, right?
Exactly. California is such a massive car market, and historically, many other states, nearly 20 of them, follow some or all of California's emissions rules.
So this ban could spread.
That's the expectation. Around a dozen states, representing maybe 35% of the whole U.S. population, are expected to adopt California's 2035 ban.
Wow. Over a third of the country potentially banning new gas car sales.
Yeah.
Okay, so who's pushing back against this and why?
The arguments for the ban are straightforward. Tackling that persistent air pollution, LA still has some of the worst ozone and cutting carbon emissions. Transportation is, 39% of California's total emissions, and light-duty vehicles are 70% of that.
So a big target for climate action.
A huge target. But the opposition is strong, primarily from Republicans, but also, interestingly, from a noticeable number of Democrats, too.
What's their main argument?
They often frame it as federal overreach, or rather state overreach, enabled by a federal waiver. The idea that one state shouldn't dictate policy for the whole auto market.
And they've taken action in Congress. I remember reading about a vote.
Yes. House Republicans use something called the Congressional Review Act, the CRA.
Ah, the tool to overturn agency rules.
That's the one. It allows Congress to nix a federal agency rule with just a simple majority in both the House and Senate. So they introduced a resolution to block the EPA waiver for California's rule.
And did it pass the House?
It did, by a vote of 246 to 164. And what really stood out was that 35 Democrats voted with the Republicans.
35 Democrats voting against California's waiver.
Yeah,
That's
right.
significant. Any from California itself.
Yes, 2 California Democrats representatives Lou Correa and George Whitesides voted against it. Plus others from states like Michigan, Indiana, New York, Florida, manufacturing states, swing states.
Which tells you something about the politics involved. So what were the specific arguments from those trying to block the ban?
The core Republican points were about limiting consumer choice, calling it an EV mandate, in effect.
Even though it's a state rule, not federal.
Right. But because other states follow, they argue it becomes a de facto national mandate. They also raise concerns about practicality, cost, the strain on the grid, supply chain security, especially reliance on China for batteries, and the impact on U.S. auto jobs.
And the Democrats who joined them. Similar concerns.
Largely, yes. Especially those from manufacturing-heavy states worried about job impacts, or maybe sensing that public enthusiasm for EVs isn't quite where policymakers thought it would be.
Yeah, I think I saw a quote from Senator Fetterman about that, about needing to listen to consumer sentiment, maybe cooling on EVs.
Exactly. That sentiment reflects a division within the party about the pace and maybe the political wisdom of pushing this transition quite so hard, quite so fast.
So the House voted to block it. What happens now? Does it go to the Senate?
It does. The Senate has until roughly mid-May 2025 to vote on whether to overturn the waiver as well.
And is the outcome certain there?
Far from it. It's not clear if there's a majority to overturn it in the Senate, and there could be procedural moves too. So the fate of California's ban is still, up in the air.
It really is so layered. It makes you wonder, like, practically speaking, what is the difference between a federal car and a California car these days? That Reddit discussion you mentioned touched on this, right?
Yeah, it was interesting. Someone initially commented basically saying, look, nowadays there's no real physical difference. All cars sold meet CARB standards anyway, CARB being the California Air Resources Board.
But others pushed back on that.
They did. People brought up examples from the last decade. BMW apparently had different engine versions, the N26 for California states, the N20 elsewhere up until maybe 2016.
Oh, interesting. So actual hardware differences.
Sometimes, yeah. And remember those compliance cars? Like that electric RT4 from the early 2010s that Toyota made just for California using a Tesla powertrain.
Right. Almost forgot about those. So it wasn't always just software tweaks.
Seems not. The discussion also got into what the regulations focus on. Like maybe California's rules push harder on CO2 reduction.
Well, the federal, or 49-state standard, might have historically focused more on smog pollutants, like Norlox.
That was one point raised. And someone else mentioned seeing a specific California emissions option code on window stickers for newer cars, like a 22 Malibu. Maybe just a tracking thing for regulators now?
Could be. What about older cars? Were differences more common back then?
Yeah, folks chimed in with repair perspectives, saying that pre-2015 vehicles sometimes definitely had different catalytic converters or O2 sensors if they were originally sold in California or, say, New York versus elsewhere.
Right.
And some even older cars pre-2010 might have had extra stuff like secondary air injection systems only on the federal versions, not the California ones.
Huh. But the trend now seems to be towards standardization.
Generally, yes. The consensus seemed to be that most newer cars just have a label saying California compliant or 50 state emissions, suggesting automakers are building one version for simplicity.
Which leads to that concept you mentioned earlier, iterative federalism.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. It's this idea that California, because it can set stricter standards and it's such a huge market.
Plus other states follow.
Right. It essentially creates pressure for automakers to just adopt the stricter California standard nationwide. It's easier than making two versions of every car.
So California sets the bar, and eventually the rest of the country catches up, even without a direct federal rule forcing it.
That's the dynamic, yeah. Think about catalytic converters way back when. California pushed early, and eventually it became the standard everywhere.
And this isn't new, this tension.
Oh, not at all. Even under Reagan, there were debates about California's authority. But the Clean Air Act's California carve-out was kind of the compromise, acknowledging their unique situation.
But now, with an actual ban on sales, opponents argue it's different. That it really could raise prices and limit choices for everyone, especially with, tariffs on imports and parts.
That's definitely a major concern being voiced, that California is effectively setting national policy through this waiver, potentially making cars less affordable or limiting the types available across the board.
So, looking ahead, if the Senate doesn't overturn the waiver, what happens? Is the ban locked in?
Well, if the Senate resolution fails, it would likely be a very long, drawn-out fight for the EPA or a future administration to try and revoke the waiver through the normal regulatory process. So, practically, California's rule might just stay in effect.
And how much does just plain old consumer demand factor into all this, regulations aside?
Oh, it's huge. Ultimately, the success of this whole EV transition really hinges on whether people actually want to buy these cars. Price, charging availability, range anxiety, all those things matter immensely, regardless of the rules.
And you can't ignore the politics here, can you?
Absolutely not. This whole debate really throws that tension into sharp relief. Environmental goals versus consumer choice versus economic impacts, especially in key auto industry states like Michigan.
It feels familiar, too. Didn't the Trump administration try to revoke California's waiver before?
They did. The framing then was largely about protecting American jobs and arguing California's rules forced automakers to make smaller, maybe less safe cars.
And now the pushback against the waiver under Biden. Is it seen as partly just pushback against Biden's policies generally and supporting fossil fuels?
That's certainly part of the narrative from some analysts, yes. That it's tied into the broader political fight over climate policy, energy policy, and undoing the current administration's agenda.
So it really feels like we're at a crossroads. You've got these ambitious federal goals, California pushing even further with this ban, and this major political and legal fight playing out.
Exactly. It's a really dynamic and complex moment for vehicle emissions in the U.S. How these federal standards interact or clash with California's goals, it's going to shape the future of driving for years to come.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? When you consider all these angles, the environmental need, the economic worries, the consumer side, the political battles, what is the fairest, the most effective way forward? How do you balance protecting the planet with people's everyday needs and economic realities?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it?
And maybe even, should one state, even a really big and influential one like California, have this much power to shape national policy on something so fundamental as the cars we drive? It's definitely something to chew on.
Absolutely. We definitely encourage you listening to, look into these rules more, keep an eye on that Senate vote when it happens, and think about what these changes could mean for your own life, your community. There's still a lot that's going to unfold here.